Hi everyone, my name is Daniel. I'd like to welcome you back to our channel. Today we are going to be concluding our episode on the Seascape in oils. So having done our initial line drawing and sketch in oil, here's where we do all of the refinement. I gotta tell you, this part is the funnest part of painting. You get to come in and really bring this thing to life. So there's a lot of trial and error in all of this, so do not expect to be able to just jump into a painting once you've done your sketch and know intuitively what to do. It takes time, and it takes videos like this as well as demonstrations and other teachers to help guide you, to help give you some direction. So I love making these videos, but they are not supposed to be in place of actual classes. It's important that you take lessons with other artists so that they can help you work on all of this stuff. But let's talk a little bit about what I'm doing now. So I'm adding some really intense darks as well as intensifying my lights. So we call this pushing value. We're really going to look for areas that need intensification. Now, why is it that I'm intensifying this particular area? Because that's my focal point. That's where I want you to look. So I'm adding more and more detail, more and more resolution. That brings me to the point of why I'm making this second part of the video. There's some things that you leave literally unfinished. So when we're talking about resolve and refinement, it's the focal point that we care to resolve and refine. Everything else we're just going to leave alone. So jumping back into what I'm actually doing, I'm adding in some cooler tones here. These are still not my brightest colors, but you'll see how I build from these darker tones into lighter and lighter tones. Now, as I look at the photograph, what I'm seeing is that there's some really bright, warm tones on those rocks. And that is kind of the glistening color of the sun on the wet rocks. There's some moss there, and there's this kind of wetness that I want to show, especially where there's light. So that's the idea behind those speckles of paint. Now, to you guys, it looks like I'm doing this in a very carefree fashion, but really it's very calculated. I want in as few strokes as possible to indicate as much information as I can. And it's come from experience that if I could just hint at what's happening, it tells the story. So what I'm noticing is that there is some color back there on that rock, but it's in the background, and you'll see later how I actually soften all of that up. It's the mid-ground that I'm really focused on. That's my focal point, right in the middle of the painting. I'm bringing in these blue colors because they're reflective of the sky as well as the colors of the ocean. And directly in front of the rocks are this beautiful orangey tone that kind of shows the sand underneath. I'm intentionally allowing for the paint to stick onto the canvas in a kind of dry fashion. So with stuff like the highlights, I'm using a lot of medium so that it flows and it looks very oily, but here I'm not. I want the paint to look dry because I want that sandy look. So getting back to those rocks, I'm going to add in, using a nice small round brush, add in a lot more oil and a nice white orange color to indicate some of those highlights there. They look like speckles of paint, and I've learned to paint this way from one of my favorite artists, John Singer Sargent, who taught his students to paint what you see. And what he was talking about was if a cloud in the sky looks like whipped cream, then slap on a piece of paint on the canvas that literally looks like whipped cream. What I'm seeing here is this kind of back and forth wavy movement of water and sand. So this is why I'm placing my paint in the fashion that I am. I've sped up the video because otherwise I'm going to bore you guys to death with all of this, but I just want you to see the build out on it. So it's not so important exactly the technique as it is the idea of indicating texture, the idea of indicating a feeling of what you're actually seeing, right? So I've said this before in my other videos, an excellent way to absolutely demolish and destroy your drawing or painting is to copy it. You become way too technical, the painting feels too stiff. That's not what we're here to do. We're here to interpret. So as I see it, I see a lot of this kind of glistening effect, spots and speckles of color, and I'm trying to get as much of that in there without overwhelming the eye. Now remember, my focus is in the middle. It's it's right in that middle ground around those rocks. So I'm going to keep building up around that area. What I'm noticing is I want a little bit more contrast here for the rocks to really push forward. So I am going to add a little bit more of those speckles of light and color that's coming from the foam of the water, the wave splashing upon itself. As I add in more and more of these lighter tones in that midground, what I'm noticing is that the background is starting to look a little too dark for me. So I'm going to continue with some of this and then eventually add a little bit more of that lighter blue in there. So I think right about now I'm mixing that color, and here it comes. You see these lighter colors coming in to create both a little bit more dramatic movement in the water, as well as creating contrast, because that's really what it boils down to. Varying degrees of contrast, not only by color, but also by value and by edge. Now what I mean by that is that background is too sharp for me. So at a certain point I'm going to come back in here and soften that up. But before I get to that, let's add just a few more of these highlights in here. So this is where the magic happens. These are the last minute touches. I'm really getting close to the end here. These are where I actually come in with almost near white colors. Now it's never a good idea to pop in white or black onto your canvas. It's just too strong and it throws off the rest of the colors on your canvas. But this is pretty much as close to white as I'm going to get. I'm adding in essentially white with a touch of orange to get some pop, to really get some of this fancy footworking. The big mistake that I see everybody make in the studio when I'm teaching is that they do this too early and it throws off the canvas. You want to really reserve those extra darks and those extra lights towards the end. So because I have done this work in terms of adding in my lights at the end, I can now determine whether I want more contrast or less contrast. And I think that those rocks over on the left hand side definitely need more of a punch. So I'm going to come back and attack that area and actually brighten that area up too. And as I do that, I want you to pay attention and see how just a little bit of these subtle changes, just a tiny bit of this paint coming in, has such a dramatic effect on the overall piece. I pop in just a little bit of white above that third rock over towards the left hand side, and all of a sudden things look much richer, much more intense. So the old adage, a little goes a long way, applies brilliantly here. Now, as I'm painting, I'm thinking very carefully about what my next steps are, because this is where a lot of artists can get themselves into some hot water. We want to make sure that we're not overdoing it with too many colors or too many brush strokes. So now let's go back and add a little bit more light in that background. I find that the colors that I'm putting down help to add a little bit more to the midground. They are a little brighter. They do draw attention towards that background, but it just felt a little too flat for my taste. So at this point, it really just becomes less of a question of technique and more of a question of overall taste. So I am going to add just a few more details in this background. So I'm bringing in just a touch more resolve here. So something interesting happens as I bring in some of these lighter colors. What I'm finding is that as I'm looking at the canvas, those shadows sure do look almost pitch black. So that's not going to work for a painting like this. There's a lot of light bouncing around. So let me just add in a little bit of detail here into the shadows themselves. This is stuff that usually is not picked up in a photograph, but you would see in real life. So I am picking up just a little faint hint of it off of the photograph, and I'm just going to intensify it now. And that creates something I call the seesaw effect, where as I lighten certain things, then other things tend to become darker because it all works within context of each other. So now that I've got lighter darks, I'm going to add even lighter lights. So here we go. We're going to just add just a little bit more here on these corners so that it feels more in context. We have this feeling of sunshine coming in. You know, I'm really trusting what the painting, how it's reading for me, how it's what it's saying to me. And what I mean by that is I switch hats. I move out of the idea of being the artist and I try to look at it from the perspective of the viewer, because it really is two people painting at the same time, the person who's creating it and the person who's actually viewing it. So you'll notice I added in this intense blue here, and what that is that's actually the splash of the water that's actually in shadow because there's a cast shadow from the rock. So I'm going to add those in too. There's definitely some highlights even within the shadow areas of this water. Those I would call minute details, really fine details that I'm adding towards the finishing touches of this painting. Now you'll notice I just added in some pretty sharp brights, as well as intensifying some of these orange and pink tones that I'm seeing in the foreground. So this is where I'm going to really look to see what things are left for me to draw attention to. I don't want a lot of attention going into the foreground, but I still want something there for you to look at so that you're not bored. I have very little room for boredom in my painting. I don't want any part of it to be boring, but I don't want to overwhelm at the same time. So that's the seesaw effect again playing out. So I just added a few more of those light blue tones over in the shadow, and here we go with a little bit of lighter tones on that rock back there. I don't want to overdo it, but I want some faint information. And what I'm not showing you in this video is that I am taking breaks. I do stop the camera. I do take 5-minute walks outside. I give myself some time to really think about these last few strokes. So having taken a break, I'm going to come back and actually soften everything. So I've got this sped up for you guys, but essentially what I did right now was to take a soft, dry brush and rub down the background so that it appears softer. So that feels a little too strong of a contrast. So I'm going to add in a few tones here that are kind of a transition so that it feels as if the background is flowing into the midground. So looking at the foreground, I'm noticing that there's just a few more touch-ups I can throw in there, a few little speckles of color to give it a more glistening effect, and that's pretty much it. My painting is done. I want to thank you guys for watching this video. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this, please send it out to your friends, share it, and kindly subscribe.